Whiskey is distilled in all 50 states, making the U.S. one of the world's largest producers of whiskey. Kentucky, however, has the largest concentration of distillers and the longest history of whiskey in America. U.S. whiskey production is split into 6 main categories: bourbon, Tennessee, rye, corn, wheat, and blended whiskeys. Contrary to popular belief, the term bourbon does not come from Bourbon County, Kentucky, though the region is largely responsible for the spirit now known as bourbon. As explained by historian Michael Veitch, author of the book Kentucky Bourbon Whiskey, An American Heritage, the term bourbon most likely has its origins in New Orleans, though a confirmed tale is lost to history. Legend has it the 2 men from Cognac, France, came to Louisville and began shipping local whiskey down the Ohio River to Louisiana's Great Port City. The Frenchmen knew the product would be popular in New Orleans, where the populace already had a taste for cognac or French brandy. The darker, sweeter whiskey thrived in New Orleans, particularly on Bourbon Street, and thus people started asking for that whiskey they saw on Bourbon Street. Though bourbon may have been christened in New Orleans, bourbon has always considered Kentucky home. Since the first distilleries until today, Kentucky remains the largest producer of bourbon, though there is no law stipulating that bourbon is to be produced solely in Kentucky. Production is spread throughout the state and is mostly concentrated in northeast Kentucky around the capital, Frankfort. What unites these spirits are the fact that they must contain at least 51% corn in their grain mash bills and must be distilled below 80% ABV. American bourbons must be aged in new American white oak barrels for a minimum of 2 years and cannot have any color or flavor additives. The barrels, as well as the generally warmer climate, are responsible for the distinctive vanilla and woody flavors in all American bourbons. The flavor profile of bourbon is mostly dependent on the grain mash bill. As a general rule, bourbon with a grain mash bill whose second grain after corn is rye will be bolder and spicier. They can even taste more similar to rye whiskey than they do to bourbons, with a very high percentage of corn in their grain mash bills. Yet, Four Roses Single Barrel, Bullet Bourbon Whiskey, and Basil Hayden's bourbon, all of which are high in rye and distilled in Kentucky, have very different characteristics. Bullet and Four Roses are very fruity, but they differ in that Bullet is slightly smoky, while the mouthfeel of Four Roses is similar to that of maple syrup. In contrast, Basil Hayden's is relatively light and more characterized by the mild zest of rye spice. In other words, sweet, fruit-forward flavors of bourbon are most prominent in Bullet and Four Roses, while Basil Hayden's is dominated by dry, peppery rye. In contrast, bourbon with a very high percentage of corn in its grain mash bill, such as Buffalo Trace's Old Charter and Tuttleton Spirit's Baby Bourbon, are very sweet. Wheat-forward bourbons, such as those produced by Maker's Mark, Rebel Yell, and Van Winkle, tend to be softer and have a more pronounced caramel and vanilla profile. The greatest difference between Kentucky bourbon and Tennessee whiskey is that the latter must be slowly filtered through charcoal from a sugar maple tree, in a process known as the Lincoln County process. The time-intensive process of slowly filtering the raw distillate lends the spirit a distinctly sweet flavor profile. Only then can it be aged in new American white oak barrels for a minimum of 2 years. With the exception of the charcoal filtration process, Kentucky bourbon and Tennessee whiskey are the same products. This is because they have the same grain mash bills, which must contain at least 51% corn. All Tennessee whiskey is bourbon, but not all bourbon is Tennessee whiskey.